Hi everyone, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their existing skill set. Every week we go live Friday at 2 p.m. with a film professional to chat and give you a chance to join us and ask questions. Today, I'm being joined by producer, writer, and editor Kathryn Robson, whose latest documentary, Circus of Books, was nominated for a 2020 Emmy. Hi Kathryn, welcome to Filmmaker U.
Hi, so nice to be here.
How are you doing with COVID and everything?
Hanging in there. I'm in Los Angeles, so it's sort of now compounded by the wildfires, and every day seems to be like a new disaster. But I'm just hunkered down at home, working, editing, so feeling pretty grateful at least to be able to have work.
One of the questions I want to ask you right off the top is you got your start at the CBC Radio here in Toronto. So I'm wondering, what did you learn in the radio realm of media that you've brought into your filmmaking career?
Yeah, I actually think radio was really foundational for me. So it was an internship at CBC. I was working on a program that no longer exists, unfortunately, but it was a program called Outfront, which was all sort of about teaching people the skills to tell their own stories, which really excited me at the time and still does. But yeah, the person, my sort of mentor for the internship, one of the first things he said to me is radio is the most visual medium, which I remember thinking was counterintuitive, but once you actually get into, production, audio production, it's so true because you're having to really paint this visual picture just through sound. But yeah, when I moved into video editing, I think I brought that mindset with me. And so when I edit, I really start with the radio cut. I start with that sort of like, can this story, function just on its own, just on sort of the merits of the story itself. And then all the visuals become this, really exciting extra component to like merge in there. And, obviously the edit changes as it becomes a more visual medium. But yeah, I really start with a radio cut still to this day.
So with your radio cut, do you build in some of the sound design as well then, because from your radio background?
Yeah, if there's something that, I'm sort of one of those editors that I can get really, really hyper-focused on something. So yeah, if I have an idea of like, oh, this would be really interesting to sound design this, I might, I might dive deep and pull in all these sound effects and start playing with it. And I almost had to just stop myself and be like, okay, no, you're still just trying to figure out the skeleton of this film. Like, don't get too hyper-focused on this one thing that may change actually a lot. So, but yeah, if I sort of feel inspired or excited that there's an opportunity to do that, I'll do it for sure.
So for Circus of Books, I know how Rachel Mason got involved. Kind of makes sense. It's her parents. So how did you become involved with that project?
So actually, it was very fortuitous. I had done my master's degree at Ryerson University in Toronto, and my thesis was on a pornography related topic. Basically, I had been looking at sort of like how the internet is changing the way that we think, and when you start doing internet research, you end up landing in this space, in porn studies, and yeah, ultimately I saw this opportunity to examine how heterosexual women in particular were engaging with pornography on the internet, because there just like wasn't a lot of information about it. But as a part of my research, I was doing this very deep dive into queer theory, because pornography is a really, it holds like a really important cultural space actually for the gay community, for the LGBTQ community, because for so long, it was literally the only place where people could see themselves reflected back to themselves in any way at all. Right? It just didn't exist in media, any other spaces. So I kind of knew all that, and I was talking to a friend of mine, actually, another producer from Canada, Vanessa Mayer, and just talking about our academic work and our research, and I mentioned this thesis, and she said, oh my God, I know this director who's making a documentary on their parents' gay porn store, and she's looking for an editor. I have to introduce you guys, you have to meet. So yeah, Rachel, we just like set up a meeting, and right from the first, meeting with Rachel, she just told me this incredible story about her family. And I was like, this is such a wild story. This is amazing. I have to be involved with this. And it was a really great rapport between the two of us. So yeah, it was just a good fit, and we started working together.
I did love, there's the moment where as a teenager, she realizes what her parents' store actually is.
Yeah.
And you just hold on this sort of jaded teenager image of her, and it's a great moment. Given what you were saying there, talking about how the internet's changing everything, and that's part of the story, is how the internet is making porn accessible and no longer needing to go to these places.
Yeah.
So how does that affect the community when all their places are shutting down? I'm thinking Circus of Books, but here in Toronto, the Beaver Bar shut down, right? Which is a bar. So, what do you see? How do you see the community changing or shifting in that perspective if they're no longer visible the way they were?
Yeah, I mean, we tackle it in the film because we really wanted to give voice to the older, LGBTQ generation as well, who, you could tell that a lot of these people felt like the younger generation actually doesn't get it, like what the value of these physical spaces were and how that is where community was formed. It was this human to human connection, this engagement in a physical space that, I think generated a really solid community in a way that I don't know that you can replicate online. And that's not to say that that a lot hasn't been gained from, online communities. I mean, you can connect with people across vast distances, and I think, can't remember who says it, but in the film, somebody's sort of like, well, it's on the one hand, it's nice that these spaces are not as necessary anymore. That you can have dating apps, and you can have bars, and whole neighborhoods, and it's in some cities at least it's a lot more safe than it used to be. But that there is something lost. There is that a kind of unity and community that's lost when you lose spaces like Circus of Books. So I think we weren't trying to lay out any kind of advocacy. I mean, the store was closed, right? So it's not like we're saving the store. It was like kind of inevitable, at least from Karen and Barry Mason's perspective. Sorry, my cat is about to join us here. But yeah, I think we just wanted to have people think about it a little bit and think about what those costs are and what's lost.
Well, it seems that everything's sort of shifting, but now we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of communities sort of stepping out and protesting and making themselves known now. The other area that really sort of caught me off guard was the Black Cat Tavern sort of segment, because I had never heard of I'd heard of the Stonewall riots and a few others, but I'd never heard of the Black Cat Tavern. So why wasn't that, you don't really go into why it wasn't more prominent in the history?
I don't know why it isn't. I mean, that was also a new story to me. I didn't know that story. I felt so much more familiar with sort of like the gay history of New York and of San Francisco, and I really didn't know about LA's kind of unique history. And Alexei Romanov, who talks about who's there, he talks about it in the film. This was several years before Stonewall. I mean, this is on record of being one of the very first movements towards what became the Pride movement ultimately. So I'm not sure why it hasn't been more widely known. I wonder if it's just sort of, I think a lot of LA history just hasn't been retained in the same way, and we haven't seen it in movies as much, and so that was something that was really important to Rachel and I, to make sure that made it into the film, because it's such a, it's so foundational. And I thought, God, how come nobody knows this? This is really important.
Well, now jumping back to your editing, how do you like to find the structure? Because you're going to be handed hours upon hours of footage in a documentary, and you need to find the story. So how did you approach that for this film?
Yeah, so I mean, it's, the process is different from film to film. Some films you go into them and the story is really not, the sort of structure in the story isn't super clear. You're really doing a lot of work to find it. I think with Circus of Books, even just my first conversation with Rachel, it was so clear what a great story this was. And it was 40 years of life lived. I mean, it wasn't necessarily that we were trying to figure out something as it was unfolding, right? It was like, this story has really already happened and the stores are coming to a close, but the bulk of what we're saying here has happened. So yeah, for this particular process, it was having a whiteboard, creating all the kind of beats of like, okay, well, these are all the major events that we know we want to talk about. And then just plotting out that kind of rising and falling action and how that was going to make sense. That was sort of like for the core story of Karen and Barry. But we also knew we wanted to have these moments where we jumped out and were able to talk about what was happening for, the LGBTQ community more broadly, just situating it in kind of time and place. So that was like figuring out where it made sense to do that was a bit of a, weaving those things together structurally was a challenge. And then we had these great like verite moments with Karen and Barry that were just, it didn't necessarily drive the plot forward, but it really like allowed you to sort of be with them and see who they were and understand their personalities and understand the relationship between Rachel and Karen in the process of her trying to make this film. And so, yeah, weaving together where those pieces fit as well.
How did you, because that was going to be one of my questions, because watching the mother and particularly Josh, her brother, those two relationships I found, like all the relationships were fascinating, but there seemed like her mother and her, there were little moments where they were sort of not arguing, but they were sort of poking at each other a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, where's the boundary for you guys when you're in the editing room? Because, this is Karen's life, right? And this is Rachel's life. So how do you determine when to pull back and when to show more of that relationship, of personal relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't, Rachel was so game to just put it all out there. I mean, she has a performance background. She has an arts background. I just think she came in with this understanding of that, yes, this is a personal story, but this is how the creative process works. Like it takes a certain amount of just trying stuff and seeing. So she was really just incredibly brave and generous in that sense. Obviously, she had a lot of sensitivity about making sure that her family was protected and, that nobody was sort of going to be at risk or anything. But yeah, she was really open to the process. Karen, I think, was just like didn't want to see the documentary from day one. Like she just didn't understand what Rachel was making, didn't like the process of making it. I think Rachel said that maybe they had even been approached by other people in the past to say like, oh, we want to do a profile on you. And they'd said no. I mean, the only reason they agreed to do it is because it was their daughter.
Mm-hmm.
But even then it was sort of reluctant. And Karen pushed back on Rachel a lot throughout the process. But I think she just trusted that, I mean, this is her daughter and she's not going to misrepresent her. And also that, now, what you find at the end of the doc is that Karen and Barry are so involved in PFLAG. And part of what they do is they tell their story a lot to sort of help guide other parents with LGBTQ children. So they were pretty well versed in that sense of telling certain parts of their story, and they were comfortable with that. Other parts they were a little less comfortable with, but they were very generous.
Well, and I was very surprised that Karen allowed the story of Josh coming out and her reaction to be told, because that actually was really quite shocking in the film. It was like a really great moment. How did you craft that with everyone's, I guess, keeping in mind their emotions and their involvement in the film,
Yeah.
because that's such a touchy subject.
Yeah, so Karen, I think, was a lot more comfortable with telling that part of the story in some ways than I think Josh was, because that is part of the story that she frequently tells in PFLAG, in these PFLAG meetings that she often leads. Josh was a lot more nervous about that because I think he really didn't want to throw his mother under the bus. That's what's sort of tricky when you're making an archival heavy documentary, or a documentary where you're talking about something that happened in the past. Josh is reflecting on this moment that was really, really painful at the time, but he knows, this transformation that his mother went through and the fact that she's become this incredible advocate. So, but we can't, he can't say like, well, she said this, but then she actually turned it all around and now she, it's like, no, we have to let the audience sit with the fact that that was what happened and it was painful in that time. And I think that was hard for him. I mean, they're really close-knit, loving family. And he was willing to be honest and obviously so great and so vulnerable in telling that story, but he was more concerned about it than Karen was, for sure.
Was there a moment or a scene or a character, and I shouldn't use character, or a person who you really wanted to get into the film, but it just didn't serve the story?
I'm trying to think. It's been, to be honest, it's been so long since I've seen all the footage that wasn't in the film. I'm trying to remember if there was anybody who didn't really make it in. I don't think so. I think we got all the sort of key interviews in.
Is there a scene then that you wanted to cut out, or sorry, you wanted to leave in but had to be cut out?
There were scenes. There were definitely scenes. There were scenes and there were story points. Like, there's other parts of Karen and Barry's backstory that are so fascinating that we would be finding out in real time as we're making the movie, as we're deep in the edit. I think Barry, we were doing a pickup interview with Barry, and he suddenly divulged that his mother had dated the getaway driver for Al Capone or something. Like what? It's so amazing. You're like, I guess that doesn't really have anything to do with this story, but that's amazing.
You're gonna have to have a sequel now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they could have their own series probably just on them. So there was that, and then there were other sort of slice of life Karen and Barry scenes that were so funny. There was one where they're at a wholesaler and they're buying bongs. They're buying sort of like, just different stuff. And it's kind of a head shop in addition to being a gay porn store. So they have just a variety of different things that they sell. And it's just, it's Karen like picking up big glass bongs and, being like, is this a bong? I mean, like equally as comical as all the other scenes, but you just can't fit it all in, unfortunately.
Now you've also, because you're also you're the producer in this, and you've also produced other documentaries and shows. So one of the things in producing is getting the interview or convincing someone who might not want to do an interview to do one. So how do you approach that as a producer, try and convince someone?
So I came on board a little bit later as a producer. Mm-hmm. Rachel initially was working with our producer, Cynthia, who she had done really so much of the legwork and lining up all the probably toughest to get interviews, and Rachel as well. I mean, Rachel also produced it, but yeah, getting the interviews with like Alaska or, people where it's like, these are not necessarily easy people to reach. My impression was that despite the fact that these people are maybe very much in demand for interviews, one, they knew it was about Circus of Books and they knew it was about Karen and Barry. They were actually just totally on board to do it because they really, had a love for the store and had a love for them. I think same with Jeff Stryker. So the interviews that by the time I came on board as a producer, which is really when we were moving into post, but knew we had a little bit more shooting to do, most of the filming we had to do was with Karen and Barry and Josh and Micah, and they had already sort of, realized that this was a real project and it was really happening and they wanted to support Rachel. So I didn't have to do a lot of that hard work. Lucky for me.
Well, I was thinking on, because you've done other docs like the 75th anniversary of Captain America, or 70th anniversary of Captain America.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think that one was actually not as difficult, partly because we were working with Marvel to do it. And a lot of the people we were interviewing were, comic book writers and people who have a lot of love for the work that they do, but don't get a lot of opportunity to talk to people about it. So those tend to be easier interviews to get. I did work on a documentary where it was kind of a more celebrity driven doc. It was called The Rainbow and Sunset, and it was about the Rainbow Bar.
Yeah, the Rainbow Room.
The Rainbow, yeah, exactly. So it was a lot of like rockers and like Ozzy Osbourne, and like that was tougher to line up those interviews because you're mostly dealing with, it's rare that you're dealing with those people directly. You're going through teams of, managers and PR people. But again, I think it's just, you want to approach everyone in good faith to sort of say, like, this isn't like, we're just trying to tell this story and you're an important part of it. And we just want to hear your, honestly, what you have to say about it. And you don't have to answer any questions that you don't feel comfortable answering, or, I think just having respect for the fact that it's very generous of people to participate in the documentary. You really can't make it without them. So yeah, extending the same generosity and respect back that they are offering you by even considering, being willing to participate. So.
For the Rainbow Room documentary, were you able to get Lemmy?
We did get Lemmy. That was amazing. Yeah, I remember that shoot day just sort of, being like, because he literally would be at the bar every single day.
Yeah, just playing the game.
Bar, right. So we showed up to film with him, and he was there. He was sitting at the bar playing his, computer game, and yeah, and we did the interview right there at the bar. And then when we heard that he passed away, it was so sad because he was, such an iconic figure and so integral to sort of that story and that space. But yeah, we were really lucky to get that interview with him.
Well, and he seems, at least anytime he seems really like rough edged, but he seems really nice, like, and genuine.
So nice, so genuine, just incredibly down to earth, actually. Like just he really is just the guy. He's just the regular at your neighborhood bar. Like there's a reason he was there every day, and he would talk to anybody. He was not a big ego on Lemmy at all.
Now, to jump back to Circus of Books, you guys were shooting as you were editing. How did that impact you in the editing suite?
So most of the documentary projects I've worked on, that's been the process, and I think that's true for most documentaries. Is it's a lot more reflexive, right? It's not like a scripted film where you have these shoot days and then you're done, and maybe you get to do some pickups, but that's kind of it. Doc is a lot more exploratory. You don't know necessarily the story you're telling until you get into the edit bay. So in part, that's why I like editing and producing, because it like they sort of reinforce each other, in a way. It's really helpful for me to be on set and kind of see through the eyes of an editor and think like, oh, I don't think we quite have it, or like we need to make sure that we, it can be simple stuff like, well, we need to make sure we get some B-roll, or we need to make sure we get some coverage, because I know if we don't have that, this is going to be impossible to edit, and vice versa, being an editor and being able to think through a producer's lens of even questions of like how expensive something might be, or what can we fair use and what can we not fair use. So yeah, I think they're kind of reinforcing positions. And the more that everybody involved in a documentary can be in a constant dialogue with each other, I think it just like serves to make a better documentary, as opposed to having it be this siloed process.
Now you're working on your next project, South Commons, but COVID's hit. So how are you still working on that? How does that work when you can't really go to locations?
Yeah, so I'm not not producing South Commons. I'm just editing it. So we've just been really focusing on that, focusing on the material that we've been able to shoot so far and kind of figuring out that structure. And I mean, we're in the very early stages. We've only got, I think, a handful of shoot days so far. But we also have this like trove of incredible archival, footage and photographs. So it's sort of figuring out like, oh, how are we piecing this all together with all this amazing material? In terms of moving forward for shooting, I mean, it's just, I think, everybody's in the same boat. You can sort of plan and you can talk about, when it's safe, this is what we'll do. But in the meantime, it's sort of, a lot is just on hold. And it's, it's not a bad time for documentary, actually, which is sort of interesting that, particularly if you're working with a lot of archival materials, there is, you can get pretty far, actually. You can sort of get the project far enough that you can have a sense of what it's going to be, so that when you can film again, you really can hit the ground running.
Now, I have one last question that I like to ask everyone I interview. What would you say your guilty pleasure film is?
My guilty pleasure film? I probably have so many, honestly. And I've been indulging a lot of them during this quarantine. I think the one that comes to mind, because I watched it recently, is Poltergeist.
Yeah, that's a great one.
It's really good. I don't even know if it constitutes a guilty pleasure because it is actually just like so good.
Yeah.
But I've been talking to everybody who will listen to me. I'm like, I don't know if you've watched it recently, but Poltergeist is so good. Like, you have to watch it.
And just thinking about the VFX at that time, it's remarkable.
Well, just this horror movie that, it holds up from a horror standpoint, but it has that, kind of Spielberg heart, and like, it's like this family story, and it's really a story about like love and, a mother's love for her kids. It's like equally terrifying and also heartwarming,
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview.
Thank you.
Good luck with the Emmys. I'm rooting for you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
Thanks.